A baby was about to be buried when something incredible happened. The mother was holding his tiny hands in a final farewell, but like a miracle, she felt him move. At first, she thought it was an illusion, but what happened next left everyone stunned. Please subscribe and don't forget to turn on the notification bell to see more daily stories that need to be heard, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Sandra, a mother devastated inside, was on the verge of burying her little son, a baby just 10 months old. That cold morning, surrounded by family and friends, she was engulfed in a mix of profound grief and disbelief. Her world seemed to have been ripped from her hands, leaving her groundless. As she looked at the small body of her son Joaquin inside the tiny white coffin, it seemed almost unreal. The room was immersed in a heavy silence, broken only by muffled sobs and whispered prayers. The father's cries, Edson's, were like a sorrowful melody. While gazing at his son's serene face, he felt like the moment could only be a nightmare. Edson gently stroked the baby's small hand, trying to imprint the sensation of his soft skin and tiny fingers that would never again grasp his with the same vitality. Sandra, beside Edson, stared at her son, vainly trying to find some peace in that moment. Memories of his laughter, his first attempts at words, and the small achievements of her son came rushing back with almost cruel clarity. He had been a deeply desired child, a ray of light in their lives, a vibrant presence that had filled every corner of the house with energy and joy. Now, standing before the lifeless body of her son, she desperately tried to find an explanation, a reason for what she was experiencing. But as the minutes passed, something began to change. Some people, as they approached to say their final goodbyes, stepped back slightly, somewhat perplexed. Murmurs arose among those present, and curious glances began to cross the room, expressing a growing unease. It was then that a close aunt of the family, upon touching the baby's face, turned to Sandra and hesitantly murmured, He feels a bit warm, don't you think?" Sandra tried to dismiss the thought, imagining it was just a reflection of body heat, an illusion caused by the desperation that everyone there was feeling. She let out a deep sigh and replied in a low, trembling voice, "It must be normal, Auntie. It hasn't been that long since he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The words weighed on her tongue like stones. However, even Sandra's words felt hollow to her. Despite her response, the glances around her started filling with doubt, and she felt a growing pressure in her chest, a sudden wave of uncertainty that overtook her mind. She looked at Edson, who now had his eyes wide open, and noticed that he, too, was beginning to question what they were feeling. Edson took a step forward, his breathing quickened, and he placed his trembling hand on the baby's forehead, hesitating as if afraid to confirm what his mind refused to accept. "Sandra," Edson murmured, his voice breaking and his eyes filling with tears, "Aunt Christina is right. Joaquin is still warm. I don't think he should be like this anymore." Sandra shook her head, trying to hold on to any rational explanation that could keep her grounded in the world she knew, but it was useless. What had been merely an echo of uncertainty now grew into a doubt pounding in her mind. She turned her gaze toward little Joaquin, observing his lifeless body as if searching for any sign of movement, any hint that the warmth could be something more than just a simple illusion. But he remained still, his delicate features serene, as though resting in a deep and eternal sleep. The family members were giving their final farewells, and only a few minutes remained before the coffin would be closed and Joaquin would be taken to the cemetery. Time seemed to move at its own pace, accelerating toward the inevitable moment. Edson kept his eyes fixed on his son, a mixture of pain and silent hope flickering in his gaze, a hope he couldn't explain or understand. The warmth they had felt, which could once be dismissed as desperation or emotional imbalance, now lingered in his thoughts as an unanswered question. Sandra, feeling the urgency of one last connection, leaned over the coffin and held her son's small hand. It was a farewell, a touch filled with everything she still wanted to say, with love that would not fade even after the earth covered that white coffin. She ran her fingers over the delicate contours of Joaquin's hand, the softness so familiar to her, and then, almost instinctively, she squeezed his tiny hand one last time. In that moment, as if by a miracle, an unexpected sensation shot down Sandra's spine. Leaving her frozen in place, she felt the faintest squeeze, almost imperceptible, as if his tiny hand had moved. She blinked several times, confused, trying to process the sensation. It can't be, she thought. This is all in my head. But the touch came again, this time a bit firmer, as if her son were clinging to life, refusing to leave behind those who loved him so much. Sandra's heart began to race, pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. It felt as if the air had been pulled from her lungs, and with a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes, she whispered to Edson, "Edson, he's squeezing my hand." Edson looked at her, stunned, trying to grasp the meaning of what she was saying. His face lit up with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. For a moment, it was as if the world around them had stopped, as if everyone was suspended in that strange and improbable moment. Edson's breathing grew uneven. Trembling, he reached out to hold the baby's other tiny hand. His touch was hesitant, laden with an expectation that was almost unbearable. Yet the small hand remained motionless beneath his fingers. The warmth was still there, defying everything they thought they knew, but there was no movement. Edson looked up at Sandra, a tear rolling down his cheek, mixing with the pain and disbelief etched across his face. "Sandra, I don't feel anything," he began, his voice breaking with desperation. Others nearby, alerted by what they overheard, came closer, reaching out to feel the baby's skin. Murmurs and exclamations spread through the room as family and friends touched the baby's small body, exchanging perplexed looks in an attempt to confirm what Sandra had felt. "Are you sure you felt him move, Sandra?" asked a cousin in a low, tense voice, reflecting the doubt that hung in the air. Still dazed, Sandra felt a certainty running through her veins, as if it were the only tangible truth amidst the chaos. "Yes, I'm sure. It wasn't in my head. I felt him squeeze my hand," she replied, her voice heavy and firm, but trembling with emotion as the murmurs among the family grew louder. Edson gripped his wife's arm tightly as fear and hope battled within his heart. "Sandra, that's not possible. You must be imagining it," he insisted, his voice trying desperately to cling to reason in the midst of the emotional chaos. But Sandra's expression told a different story. There was a conviction in her eyes that couldn't be ignored. That brief moment of uncertainty quickly turned into a desperate decision. Sandra called out to her friend Davi, a man of medium height with sharp, observant eyes, one of the family's closest friends. She asked him to get help. Sensing the gravity of the situation and the couple's state of shock, Davi didn't hesitate for a second. He darted out, crossing the street with hurried, agitated steps toward the nearest pharmacy. There, the pharmacist on duty, Mr. Felipe, a man in his 50s with a tired expression, was organizing shelves. "Felipe, you have to come now," Davi exclaimed breathlessly. His words tumbling out in a mix of desperation and urgency filled Davi's voice. "It's Sandra's son, the baby. Something is very wrong. He might be alive." The pharmacist raised his eyebrows, pausing for a moment as he processed Davi's words. The customers in the pharmacy, who had caught the beginning of the conversation, fell silent, exchanging curious and uneasy glances that ranged from surprise to disbelief. "What? How is that possible?" murmured Felipe, frowning. "Are you sure? They felt him move? His skin isn't cold like it should be? You have to come now," Davi insisted, his eyes pleading. Without further questions, Felipe quickly grabbed his stethoscope and a portable monitor, his fingers trembling slightly as he gathered the equipment. Although he had witnessed emergencies before, he had never faced something like this. His mind swirled with questions, but he fought to stay calm as he followed Davi to the funeral parlor. The journey there seemed longer than it actually was. Felipe could feel the weight of expectation pressing on his shoulders, a responsibility he knew was enormous, but one he couldn't ignore. When they arrived at the parlor, the murmurs among the relatives grew louder, spreading like wildfire. People turned to watch the pharmacist's entrance, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and dread. Could it be a medical mistake? An older aunt whispered, clutching a handkerchief to her chest. How can he be alive now? Imagine burying him alive, murmured a pale-faced cousin, his expression filled with horror. Felipe felt the air in the room grow heavy, every face around him laden with tension unlike anything he had experienced before. He felt a pressure unlike anything he had experienced in his entire career. Felipe approached Sandra and Edson, who looked at him with pleading, hopeful eyes. Without saying a word, he began the evaluation, trying to control his own breathing, which came in short, rapid gasps. "Everyone, please, silence," Felipe said, attempting to make his voice sound calm, though it trembled slightly. The room fell quiet for a moment, but the anticipation was palpable. Felipe placed his hand on the baby's chest and felt a warmth and softness that shouldn't have been there. His eyes narrowed as he carefully applied the stethoscope, moving it gently. For a moment, Felipe thought he heard a faint sound, like the distant beat of a drum, but then silence. He tried again, adjusting the position of the stethoscope, but the uncertainty returned. This can't be," Felipe murmured to himself, a shiver running down his spine. Was it possible that he, too, was imagining things? That his mind was playing tricks on him, influenced by the overwhelming pressure in the stifling room? The murmurs among the crowd began to rise again, and Felipe, noticing how the agitation was affecting his focus, raised his hand. "I need everyone to leave, now," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "I need absolute silence to evaluate the baby." The request sparked a mixture of surprise and reluctance among the crowd. Worried glances were exchanged as people crossed the room, but little by little, the hall began to empty. The murmurs turned into heavy, dragging footsteps, accompanied by sighs and whispers of doubt. "I can't believe this is happening," an uncle said, his voice breaking with emotion. Felipe waited until the door closed and the room was enveloped in an almost surreal silence. He leaned over the baby once more, the sound of the clock on the wall seeming amplified in the stillness. Pressing the stethoscope to the child's chest again, this time with greater focus, he listened intently. Then he stood and turned to Sandra and Edson. "I'm going to call the fire department. This is more serious than I imagined," he stated without revealing any specific results. Sandra and Edson exchanged glances, a mixture of fear and hope shining in their eyes. It was a moment where everything could change, yet every possibility was an abyss of uncertainties. As they waited, Edson gripped Sandra's hand tightly, searching for some kind of support or certainty that neither could provide. "Sandra, could it be? Could our son still be alive?" he murmured almost to himself, the doubt piercing his chest like a sharp knife, shredding every layer of rationality he tried to hold on to. Sandra's face was pale, but she couldn't shake the growing hope, even as her mind insisted on reminding her that all of this could be just an illusion. Finally, the sound of the fire engine siren broke the oppressive silence in the room. A group of firefighters entered, evaluating the situation with serious expressions and attentive eyes. The leader of the group, a man with a composed demeanor, stepped forward with a serious expression and firm posture. He approached the couple with a nod of his head. He seemed to understand the gravity of what this moment meant for Sandra and Edson, and with a look filled with empathy, he began organizing the team to check the baby's condition. The parents watched every movement of the firefighters with hearts constricted and trembling hands. The officer, with firm yet careful hands, took the oximeter and tried to place it on the baby's tiny foot. The difficulty was evident. The foot was so small and delicate that he had to adjust the device several times to ensure it was properly positioned. The device didn't show an immediate response. Sandra felt a pang of disappointment mixed with a paralyzing fear. But before she could react, the firefighter adjusted the oximeter and tried again. The tension in the room was palpable, each second seeming to stretch on as those present held their breath. This time, to everyone's surprise, the small screen on the device began to show numbers. First, the oxygen saturation. Everything was happening so quickly it felt like a nightmare. Despair dominated Edson's expression, while Sandra gripped his hand tightly, as if somehow that could prevent fate from taking her child away. The monitor revealed vital signs in the baby who had been declared dead. The room filled with disbelief and hope as the surprised firefighter checked for signs of life. Urgently, he announced that the baby needed to be taken to the hospital immediately. Edson and Sandra were both overwhelmed with emotion and astonishment. They followed the firefighters to the ambulance, but were stopped by the officers, who insisted they needed to go by car. The confused family didn't understand why they couldn't accompany their child. A cousin of Edson offered to drive them, and the family followed the ambulance. During the trip, they reflected on the possibility that they had almost buried their child alive, while Edson felt the weight of the injustice and medical negligence. They were anguished by the thought of their child being alone in the ambulance, surrounded by strangers, and the doubt about the medical errors consumed them. The pain and fear of losing Joaquin for the second time tormented them, while the mystery of his supposed death remained unexplained. Finally, the ambulance arrived at the hospital and the firefighters rushed inside with the baby. Sandra and Edson got out of the cousin's car and ran toward the entrance, but they were stopped again. "You must wait at reception. We're doing everything we can to stabilize him," said a nurse with a compassionate but firm expression. Sandra collapsed into a chair, her body trembling with nerves, and Edson stood by her side, pale-faced, unable to say a word. Time seemed to stretch as they waited for news. Minutes passed like hours, and with every second, their desperation grew. Finally, a doctor approached with a faint hope in his eyes. "Mr. Edson, Mrs. Sandra," he began calmly, "we managed to stabilize his vital signs, but we'll need to run detailed tests to understand how and why he was mistakenly declared dead. For now, it's important that you stay calm and trust that we will do what's best for him." Those words were both a relief and a new burden at once. Although they were relieved to know their child was alive, the trauma of almost losing him was still fresh. Sandra hugged Edson, and they both shed tears of relief and gratitude, still trying to process everything they had just experienced. They remained there, holding each other, waiting for the opportunity to see their son, while silently making promises of protection and eternal love in their hearts. The impossible had happened, and little Joaquin, reborn from the improbable, now had the promise of parents who would never again leave him unprotected. As the heavy silence enveloped them, Sandra began to recall the recent moments with her son, scenes that now blended with the current fear. She remembered how it all started in such a common, harmless way. A simple cold, a routine issue, something experienced parents would know how to handle. But what should have been just a passing inconvenience turned into a spiral of events she never could have imagined. It all began just 3 days ago when baby Joaquin started showing signs of discomfort, continuous crying, and a low fever. Sandra was worried, but thought it might just be something temporary, maybe a little cold, or even the first teeth coming in, as babies often react this way to small ailments. That night, Joaquin's crying was different, hoarse and exhausted, resonating throughout the house, making his parents feel an increasing sense of anxiety. He was writhing, moving his little legs as if something deeply bothered him. When morning came, the parents decided they could wait no longer and took the baby to the hospital. Upon arrival, they found a desolate scene, a crowded and chaotic environment filled with a sense of hopelessness and muffled sounds. Sandra vividly remembered the desperation of that morning, the endless hours spent waiting to be seen. With every passing minute, Joaquin's fever seemed to rise, turning his face a dangerously red color. "I've been here since dawn and nothing," commented a woman beside them, her voice hoarse from waiting. "I passed by the pediatrician's office, and he was just sitting there looking at his phone. What a disgrace." The words ignited Sandra's and Edson's fury as they looked at the closed door of the doctor's office, then toward the reception where an employee didn't even raise her eyes from the paperwork she was filling out. Indignant, they approached her. "Miss, our son has had a high fever for hours. Could you please ask the doctor to attend to him?" Sandra pleaded, her voice trembling with concern and exhaustion. The receptionist, with a distant look, simply responded, "I've already informed the doctor. You need to wait." Wait? The words sounded like a cruel sentence. The clock showed they had been there for 2 hours, and Joaquin's condition was visibly worsening. Sandra felt her heart shrink every time she looked at her son, lying in her arms without the energy that once brightened his little face. When they were finally called, they entered the office exhausted, but trying to maintain their composure. The first thing they noticed was the doctor's indifferent gaze, who didn't even bother to look up from his phone. Immediately, Sandra felt her blood boil but held back the explosion. They needed his help, whether he liked it or not. "What happened?" the doctor asked emotionlessly, still glancing at the device's screen. Sandra quickly explained the symptoms: the constant crying, the rising fever. The doctor mechanically nodded, as if listening to a shopping list, and repeated questions Sandra had already answered, making clear his lack of attention. Without properly examining Joaquin, he prescribed some medicine and began filling out the prescription. "Give him this, it will help bring down the fever and relieve the discomfort," he said while refocusing on his phone. Sandra, incredulous, couldn't contain her outrage. "You're not even going to examine him?" she asked, her voice low but filled with contained fury. The doctor sighed as if it were a great effort, and with visible disinterest, he quickly listened to the baby's lungs. The exam lasted only a few seconds, and he immediately pulled away, saying, "It's just a slight cold." There was no need to examine him. "I already knew," with an ironic, tired smile. "You can go home." The entire consultation lasted less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes of disdain and negligence after nearly 3 hours of waiting. Sandra and Edson left the office with a mixture of anger and helplessness. They knew something wasn't right, but they had few options. They returned home, clinging to the hope that the medicine would work. However, that promise of relief didn't last. Hours later, Joaquin began having difficulty breathing. His tiny lungs seemed to struggle for every breath, and his lips started to take on a bluish tint that froze his parents' blood. Desperation overtook Sandra and Edson, their eyes filled with fear, their hands trembling and their hearts racing. Without hesitation, they wrapped Joaquin in a blanket and rushed back to the hospital, the journey feeling longer and filled with obstacles like never before. Upon arriving at the hospital once again, they encountered the chaos still lingering in the air, reflecting the precariousness of public health. Moans, coughs, and exhausted looks from other patients created a chaotic and suffocating atmosphere. Sandra and Edson pushed through the crowd, their faces marked by grief, and headed to the reception, where they once again begged for immediate attention. This time, they were finally attended to with more urgency. Realizing the gravity of the situation, they decided to admit Joaquin to the ICU. They were attended by the same doctor who had been negligent and dismissive earlier, but this time, seeing the baby's condition worsen, he acted quickly, preparing the child for transfer to the pediatric intensive care unit. The tension in the air was thick as the medical professionals worked together, trying to save Joaquin's life. As the medical team took him away, Edson and Sandra's anguish grew, but a faint hope also emerged, as their son was finally receiving the care he deserved. Edson clasped his hands in a pleading gesture, his eyes fixed on the door separating the ICU hallway. The moments that followed were filled with unbearable tension. The hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses echoed in the hallway, but none brought news. Sandra held Edson's hand so tightly that both of their fingers went numb, yet neither of them dared to let go. The fear that united them was also what kept them standing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the ICU door opened. Dr. Moises appeared, his expression serious and tired, his uniform wrinkled, and his hands holding a folder, creating an image that froze the parents' hearts. "We did everything we could, but the situation was very critical," he said without preamble. "The death has been declared." The words fell on Sandra and Edson like an avalanche. The hallway, once full of movement, seemed to close in around them, becoming a deafening, cold void. Sandra collapsed into tears, a desperate and anguished sound that made other patients and staff stop, filled with compassion and sorrow. Edson, with a pale face and eyes wide in shock, felt the rage and helplessness intertwining in his chest like thorns. The care that should have been careful and prompt had turned into a tragedy. The negligence, the lack of attention from Dr. Moises, and the long hours of waiting that Joaquin had endured earlier tormented Edson's mind, turning the pain into something deeper, something that demanded answers. Edson remained frozen for a moment, feeling the blood pulse in his. The heat of anger replaced the coldness of shock at his temples. The pain of the loss was unbearable, but there was something else there, something burning him from the inside that he could not ignore. He looked at Dr. Moises, who was still holding the folder and avoiding the parents' gaze. The silence between them was a provocation, an unspoken accusation. Finally, Sandra broke the silence. "If you had done your job right, my son might be alive now," she shouted, her voice trembling and hoarse, echoing through the cold hallways of the hospital. Her expression was a mix of desperation and uncontrollable rage. "This morning, you didn't even look at him. You barely lifted your eyes from your damn phone." Other patients and staff stopped to watch, some with expressions of compassion, others with surprise. Edson, still in shock and with tears running down his face, could not react. His strength was depleted, and Sandra's scream seemed to be the only voice he had at that moment. Dr. Moises finally looked up, but his face remained stiff and defensive. "Sir, I understand your pain, but your son's condition worsened unexpectedly. We did everything we could when he arrived in critical condition." His voice was a mix of formality and self-preservation, as if the words were a shield to avoid responsibility. "You're wrong, damn it," Sandra snapped, stepping forward with clenched fists. "If you had actually paid attention, if you had cared more about something other than your phone this morning, maybe this wouldn't have happened. You left him waiting for hours with a high fever, and when you finally examined him, it was as if it didn't matter at all. And now—" She stopped, her voice breaking as she tried to hold back the tears. "Now he's gone." Whispers spread through the hallway, and some people shook their heads in solidarity. An older nurse who had been watching the scene with tear-filled eyes turned away, well aware of the reality of the overload and sometimes the negligence that permeated. The silence that followed was interrupted by Edson, who, with his voice still choked, whispered, "Why didn't they care? Sandra, why did they let him wait so long?" Her gaze turned to the doctor, this time more sorrowful than accusatory, searching for an answer she knew wouldn't come. Dr. Moises, pressured by the tension in the hallway, took a deep breath and stepped back, his expression becoming even more rigid. He seemed to be looking for something to say, some words of comfort or justification that could ease the weight of the accusation, but he said nothing. His silence only confirmed to everyone present that, perhaps, just perhaps, Sandra was right. The memories of that dark moment flooded Sandra's mind with overwhelming force, the hours of waiting, the negligence, and the indifferent expression of the doctor repeated in her memory. Each painful detail amplified the whirlwind of emotions that suffocated her. She closed her eyes for a moment, struggling against the anger and despair, feeling as if time had stopped. But then, reality brought her back with brutal force, interrupting the thoughts. Memories of what they had lived through days earlier returned to the present, where, for the third time, they were there in the hospital, anxiously waiting for news of their little son, who had surprisingly shown signs of life during the wake. The sound of firm, controlled footsteps in the hallway caught their attention. 2 police officers had arrived, bringing an air of seriousness and urgency. They approached slowly and asked for a detailed description of what had happened. The couple took a deep breath, gathering strength to recount the entire sequence of events that culminated in the tragedy. Edson, with a heavy voice and slightly trembling, described the first visit to the hospital, explaining that their son Joaquin had a high fever and discomfort. They waited for more than 2 hours before being attended to. When they called us, a young doctor attended us, Edson said, controlling the anger in his voice. He was Dr. Moises. He spent time on his phone without even properly looking at Joaquin. He only examined him because Sandra asked. Then, he discharged us, saying it was just a mild cold. The younger officer listened attentively, noting every detail, while the senior officer nodded in agreement, indicating that he understood the gravity of the situation. Sandra, with a broken voice, added, hours later, his fever started to rise, and he had trouble breathing. We rushed him back, and they took him directly to the ICU. But shortly after, they said he didn't make it, declaring our little son dead. She took a deep breath, trying to contain herself. Edson, with a broken voice from the pain, continued, but even that wasn't done right. During the wake, we realized that he was still alive. He was warm, and when his mother took his hand, she felt a squeeze. It was weak, but it was real. We almost buried our son alive. The officers exchanged looks, visibly disturbed. Edson continued, then we called the firefighters. They confirmed that Joaquin still had a heartbeat, and they brought him to the hospital, but for some reason, they didn't let us accompany him. I don't understand that. Sandra, with a lost look and trembling voice, added, it was desperate. All we wanted was to be by our son's side, but they stopped us. The officers continued writing, and the senior officer asked cautiously, how long did it take for the firefighters to arrive? About 15 minutes, but to us, it felt like an eternity, Edson replied. They evaluated him, detected the signs, and said he needed detailed tests here at the hospital. And we've been waiting ever since. The police officer's expressions reflected the gravity of the story, and the more experienced officer sighed deeply. At the end of the statement, he looked at Edson and Sandra with seriousness. Before we speak, we will file a report so the situation can be thoroughly investigated. We need to gather testimonies from the doctors, nurses, and everyone involved in the care. Your account already helps a lot in understanding the context, and now we will do everything we can to find out what really happened. Edson and Sandra nodded, a feeling of relief and apprehension filling them. Moises finally appeared to deliver news, interrupting the conversation with the police. The doctor's expression was neutral, but there was an obvious concern in his gaze, and he spoke in a low, measured voice, showing no great emotion. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any vital signs in your son, he announced in a tone that mixed regret and formality. We did an electrocardiogram to be sure, but there was no response. I'm sorry. We performed all the necessary tests, but there was no cardiac activity. Edson and Sandra looked at each other, shock returning in waves. It was as if they were hearing the painful news for the second time, living a nightmare that was repeating itself. But the firefighters said he had a heartbeat. How is it possible that he was alive and now he's not? Edson asked desperately for answers, his voice now marked by a mix of indignation and confusion. The doctor sighed, visibly uncomfortable, and began to explain in technical terms how pulse oximeters could sometimes pick up false pulses, especially in cases of patients who had recently passed away. He mentioned interference that could have led to inaccurate readings, but his scientific explanations were empty words for the parents who were only looking for an emotional reason, an answer that could fill the void they were feeling. And the temperature of his body? Sandra asked, still searching for some sense of what was happening. It was warm, the doctor responded. That doesn't make sense. The doctor hesitated, showing rare professional uncertainty. He seemed to be trying to find the best way to explain a phenomenon that he didn't fully understand. There are cases where the body can retain heat for longer than expected, especially if the death occurred only a few hours ago. It's rare, but it happens occasionally. Edson, his mind spinning, felt that the doctor's words seemed to contradict everything they had experienced at the wake. and now he found himself facing a completely baffling situation. Sandra felt lost, as if each new explanation was nothing but a desperate attempt to justify what seemed unjustifiable. Edson, beside her, kept his gaze fixed on Dr. Moises, his eyes pleading for some true answer, something beyond technical terms and mechanical diagnoses. She shook her head in denial, as if refusing to accept it. But we saw him. We felt him alive, Sandra whispered, her voice laden with pain. This can't be a mistake. He squeezed my hand. It was weak, but it was real. Dr. Moises took a deep breath, seeming to deal with the weight of the accusations and the family's suffering. He briefly averted his gaze before meeting the parents' eyes again. I understand that this situation is devastating for you, and I am deeply sorry, he said in a more measured, almost humane tone. But everything we did here followed medical protocols. There are rare cases where erroneous signals appear, but I assure you that we followed all the necessary procedures. Sandra, still fighting against the doctor's words, clenched her fists, trying to hold on to her composure. The officers, attentive, observed. With each word, they exchanged worried glances, and one of them intervened, addressing the doctor. Doctor, we will need a detailed explanation of all the procedures carried out. This report must be well documented. The doctor nodded with a stiff expression, aware that the situation wouldn't end there. He turned to the officers and explained, "You can call me at any time for my statement. We are at your disposal." However, Sandra couldn't simply accept that explanation. She felt consumed by the desire for justice, the need to know the truth. The image of Joaquin, her son alive during the wake, wouldn't leave her mind. She knew that for her and Edson, this was only the beginning of a long battle. As Dr. Moises walked away with one of the officers, Sandra, distrustful of his words, which up until then had seemed cold and arrogant, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The doctor's attitude seemed odd and his explanations unsatisfactory. It was as if he was hiding something, and worst of all, something related to the life of her son Joaquin. Without wasting any time, she decided to act. In a more discreet moment, she called the most experienced officer aside and, in a low but firm voice, shared her intuition. "I feel like he's lying. Something's not right. Dr. Moises is hiding something. Please, go to my son's room, find him, and look for yourself. I don't trust that man." The officer, moved by Sandra's distress, didn't hesitate. He knew he needed to investigate. Carefully, he went to the floor in the room where Joaquin was hospitalized. When he arrived there, something made him stop, surprised. Under the watchful eyes of the doctors, the baby was alive, connected to a series of machines, still breathing, although in a fragile state. Shocked, the officer wasted no time. Without offering any explanations, he ordered the arrest of Dr. Moises, who was attempting to leave the hospital, already planning to get rid of the baby to avoid negligence charges and to prevent the truth from coming to light. Sandra and Edson, desperate, ran to Joaquin's room. Upon entering, they couldn't believe their eyes. Their son was there, still alive, although in critical condition. The shock and emotion mixed into a whirlwind of feelings. The hope that seemed lost now filled their hearts. Soon, the hospital director was called to be informed about what had truly happened. The situation was far from simple. Dr. Moises' actions, which had been carefully covered up, were finally being exposed. The hospital would have to face the consequences of the mistake made, and more importantly, Joaquin's life was finally being saved, with other doctors now working hard to help him as best as they could. Joaquin and his family's case gained significant attention, with a public outcry that spread throughout the city. TV, radio, and even social media continuously reported the emotional and terrifying story of the baby who had been declared dead but survived against all odds. Every day new details about Dr. Moises' negligence came to light, generating public outrage. Joaquin's story was no longer just about a child fighting for his life, but about the strength of a family and the importance of truth. For weeks, The entire community united in prayer and support for the family. Posters were hung, candles were lit, and people gathered in front of the hospital to show solidarity. The love and hope people dedicated to Joaquin were palpable, as if through his recovery, everyone was also healing from a collective suffering. And then, finally, the good news came. Joaquin began to react. Slowly, he opened his eyes, and his father's first smile upon seeing his son awake was enough to move everyone around them. The doctors who had not believed in his recovery were now witnessing the miracle happening before them. With much care and monitoring, Joaquin began to recover well and over time, completely. His once fragile little body now showed signs of strength and resilience. Upon returning home, Joaquin's family no longer knew what routine was. Every day, every hour, even every minute had become too precious to waste. They had learned to appreciate the small gestures, the sincere hugs, the shared laughter, everything that perhaps before had been taken for granted. Sandra and Edson, still deeply moved but with a new light in their eyes, felt grateful for every second together. With the end of the process, Dr. Moises was convicted of medical negligence and remains in prison awaiting trial for the consequences of his actions. His career, built over the years, was ruined by his own lack of ethics and humanity. Society demanded justice, and that justice was finally served. But for Joaquin and his parents, the true victory lay in his recovery, in seeing their son's life renewed and unfolding before them like a new opportunity for happiness. Now, in the peace of their home, the family lives intensely every gesture of affection, every moment of joy, as a reminder of what truly matters, the unconditional love they feel for each other. The difficulties they faced turned into valuable lessons, and as they look toward the future, Sandra, Edson, and Joaquin know that with love and unity, they can overcome any obstacle. And so, the nightmare that nearly destroyed their lives transformed into a story of resilience, reminding us that no matter how dark the journey may seem, there is always light at the end of the tunnel. Have you witnessed a case of medical negligence? Share your opinion in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends as well. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to watch more fascinating stories. Have a great day.